Just click. Yep. Yep. So let's see. Yeah, if there's one thing you remember at the end of this talk, it's hopefully that we're trying to do experiments at very, very high pressures, quite analogous to the deepest interior of some of the massive planets being discovered today. And of course, those types of experiments require a huge collaboration, and several of those collaborators are here today, including one of the session organizers. So let's see. Let me start here. A few years ago, several years ago, we were holding these workshops on trying to understand how we access experimentally some of these very deep interior conditions, and David Stevenson came to our workshop and showed this plot, although I've embellished it a little bit, which essentially taking the mass-radius relationships from many of the observed exoplanets and using very simple balance equations, you can estimate the interior pressures, and the interior pressures are quite large, and they extend from on the order of tens of millions of atmospheres to billions of atmospheres. And those pressures are somewhat different than we're used to experiencing. So traditionally, high pressure physics extends from pressures that are able to crush crystal lattices at sort of at 1,000 atmospheres, and up to maybe 1,000,000 atmospheres, which is comparable to the deep interior of Earth, and really fundamentally changes the chemistry as we're used to it at the surface of the Earth. But then, in the larger planets, pressures extend up to tens of millions of atmospheres or 100 million of atmospheres, and those pressures really distort the inner core orbitals of the electrons, and so really the materials behave in a fundamentally different way. So what we've been trying to do is explore those types of systems in the laboratory. And to do that, I show a phase diagram put out by Lars Stiksrud many years ago, at least at one of our workshops. In temperature pressure space, this shows for iron. And the two ways that you can compress matter at these very, very extreme conditions, you can imagine trying to keep the material cold, and so you compress the material very slowly, and slow is really launching a compression wave on the order of the sound speed. And if you do that, then essentially you can keep close to something close to an isentrope and explore crystal structures at very, very high pressures. And we've gotten to the point where we can really compress materials up to many tens of millions of atmospheres, and we're starting to do diffraction and EXAFs at those. Another type of compression technique is to use a shock wave, and those types of compression waves go faster than the speed of sound, and that allows you to access both higher pressures as well as higher temperature states. And that's really primarily what I'll describe today, is a couple of experiments where we use shock waves to explore both the melting curve of silica and also properties of helium and hydrogen. So let's see, let's start. You've heard a lot about why the melting region is important in terrestrial planets, and so I don't need to go into this, but in essence, this is a plot from Lars Stiksrud's recent paper showing the core melting and mantle melting, and for both, let's see if I can use this, yes, green and red, beautiful. So for a single Earth mass planet and a 10 Earth mass planet, and really what's important in what I'll show is, where this melting takes place. Does it occur actually in the mantle or in maybe an iron-rich core? Okay, so the way we do experiments, it's shockwave experiments. It's quite a traditional way where we use a laser to generate a shockwave. And that shock wave moves through some ablator material. So we launch we shine a laser onto a surface that makes the surface very hot, and it creates an ablation process which launches a compression wave into the sample. That compression wave moves through a preheat shield and a quartz standard, and then the sample that we'll talk about mostly, which is stishovite here. And so these shocks are so strong that the shock wave is conducting. And that conducting shock front reflects light. And so we can bounce green light off of the shock front and essentially, as was shown before, map the Doppler shift, which gives us velocity histories of that shock wave and also the reflectivity. In addition, because the shock front is optically thick, we can map through the spectral radiance the temperature, since we have the reflectivity. Okay, so this is just an example data set which shows across the target fringes produced by these, this Doppler shifting interferometer, and in green the velocity history as a function of time. What we've done is we've done a whole series of measurements to map, using steady shock waves to map the pressure versus density and pressure versus shock velocity. So from this shock velocity in a decaying shock, we can essentially map that into pressure. Now, in addition to the shock velocity and shock pressure as a function of time, we also map the spectral radiance, or in this case, convert that to temperature. And so instead of using steady waves, we use a decaying wave, and that decaying wave allows us to see very subtle features in, the phase diagram. And in this particular case, in this raw data set, you can see a plateau in this spectral radiance as a function of time. Now, when you combine those two data sets, this is the central result for silica. And what's shown here are in gray, this gray band. These are all of the different colored bands are the recent data described here. And in the case of fused silica, the fused silica comes down and that temperature meets up with data collected long ago from Tom Ahrens's group. And so that little jump there is an indication of the melt curve for fused silica crossing the melt curve. Similarly with quartz. And now the new data on stishovite, which shows we can extend this melt curve all the way out to about 6 million atmospheres. So in essence, taking those data as well as data collected quite recently in a whole series of other experiments, we can plot the melt curves for MgO, these new data on silica, MgSiO3, and also some recent results and on iron. And I guess I should add a commercial here. While I'm only talking about silicates here, there'll be a poster later on Wednesday morning where Rick Krause will talk about an effort to really explore the melt curve of iron to very, very high pressures. In this particular case, probably the most interesting thing is the fact that the silica melt curve crosses that of iron. So in the center of these terrestrial planets, there's a blurring of what that core mantle boundary might be. And understanding how that might affect both the formation as well as the current our Earth, as well as extrasolar planets, terrestrial planets. Now let's see, I think probably the second most important part of this is to look at the specific heat as well as the reflectivity. And so the specific heat, this is something we saw early on in fused silica, but also seems to occur in stishovite, which means at quite higher densities. The specific heat is quite a bit larger than what you would expect, which means it can contain quite a bit more energy than what traditional models would expect. So in terms of planetary impacts, mapping that evolution would need to take into account this larger specific heat. But also the conductivity. It's interesting, all of the materials that we've looked, all of the different silicates and oxides that we've looked at, when the material melts, it becomes conducting. And that's, again, the case for silica, where, in fact, at relatively high shock pressures, what we find is that the conductivity is close to that of iron. Okay, now the other example I'd like to show, I guess briefly, is something that was pointed out earlier by Lars Stixrud in this session, and that is has to do with helium and hydrogen. He did a nice job motivating this. In essence, there's this big question as to whether or not we understand the evolution of Saturn given its luminosity and our current equation of state models. And one of the thoughts early on by David Stevenson and many others was that perhaps helium and hydrogen phase separate, and that allows sort of a different thermal evolution of the planet than a simple traditional model. Okay, so again, the experiments that we do are very similar to the ones that I just showed. The difference here is that to do experiments on helium and hydrogen, you have to pre-compress the target, much like what the experiment shown earlier on water. These pre-compressions extend up to 6 GPa. So we essentially pre-compress helium and hydrogen in a diamond anvil cell, and then we launch a shock wave through it. So in this particular example, we have our diamond anvil cell. We use a quartz as a standard, and then the helium and hydrogen is in this volume. So again, we map the shock velocity in the quartz and the shock velocity in the helium-hydrogen mixture to get the equations of state, as well as mapping temperature and reflectance. And so just to point out, so we've done a number of different measurements on different pre-compressions as well as different concentrations. Don't try and go through all this. That was just a proof of principle. Let me just point out the single most important observation, and that turns out to be in the reflectivity as a function of pressure or temperature. And this particular plot shows the reflectivity as a function of temperature, where the blue data are for 11% helium and hydrogen and a pre-compression of 4 GPa. Now the thing to point out, there's two features here sort of shown in the red dots. So the low pressure temperature red dot is where there's a kink in the reflectivity, and then as you go up in temperature or reflectivity and temperature and pressure, there's a big jump in the reflectivity. And that big jump is not seen in higher concentrations of helium and hydrogen. It's not seen in pure hydrogen. It's not seen in pure helium. There's something else going on in this system. Now, if you just keep track of those two red dots and we take a more careful look at the temperature versus pressure, essentially temperature versus pressure, this is for the same concentration and same pre-compression. These are the same two red dots that we were showing earlier. In essence, those two red dots, right at the place where there's that jump in the reflectivity, there's a depression in the temperature. That depression in the temperature, maybe makes sense. It's sort of, you can imagine just taking extra energy out of the system and putting it into separation of the helium and hydrogen. So I guess our picture currently is that we have these two regions sort of indicate where the helium and hydrogen goes from miscible to immiscible and then back into a miscible region. And that can be compared to some of the calculations shown earlier, and I guess maybe I could map Lars's data on top of this. So what we've done is, this is Morales's recent work, I guess 2013. We've essentially scaled that up to match our data. And so if you take that brown line as our data, both Jupiter as well as Saturn have a pretty fair component in this mixed phase region. And so I guess Lars, maybe you can correct me, but I think your line was down here. So anyway, so that's our best guess at this point. And maybe I'll just close there. So I guess we're doing a series of experiments. We're trying to compress matter to very high pressures and keep them solid. And we're using, again, diffraction, XAFs, wave profiles to look at those crystal structures. And in the fluid phase, we've taken materials up to quite high pressures. These were relatively modest. We've taken materials up to I guess, 1 billion atmospheres pressure and have mapped out the pressure temperature and are working on temperature, pressure density, working on temperature. And thanks for your attention.
Questions?
Yeah, atomic mass. You know. No, atom fraction. Yeah.
Any other question? In the back?
Let's see, am I able to go backwards here? Takes off. I would have said that it's pretty flat, but yeah. So the green curve is the melt curve. Yeah.
It's log on the next one. Should the next.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, this is. Yeah. Thanks. This is a log plot, so it's a little more complicated to. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Any other question? I have one. Can you show what it means in terms of the interior of the planet for the helium hydrogen? This slide you.
Oh, this. Yeah, that's yeah, there you go. So, yeah, thank you. So, in essence, what that means is, if you you look at the, pull out this pen again. So, in terms of Saturn. You can sort of see Morales's predictions and Lorenzen's predictions, and our data for Saturn would have a much broader range of demixed region, and even in Jupiter there's quite a large range of demixing. Now, so to be fair, what that actually means in terms of this whole idea of correcting for this question of understanding the evolution of Saturn. I think there's a lot, we still have to think through that whole problem. But one of the things that Stephanie Bergou pointed out was that, you know, it might be a good indicator as to why, you know, the fraction of helium is less at the surface. So.